The winter mornings in Milwaukee had a way of sinking into the bones, curling into the joints like something permanent. It wasn't the cold itself that bothered Margaret Holloway. Not really. She had lived through harsher winters in the north, back when her late husband Henry was still alive, and the world made a little more sense. No, what weighed on her now wasn't the snow on the streets, but the quiet. The kind that dripped through the walls of her small home and made everything feel further away than it should. At 72, Margaret had grown used to the rhythm of solitude. Her life had gradually shrunk to routines, simple, soft-edged, rituals she carried out with silent precision. She would rise at 5, boil water for tea, wrap herself in her thickest shawl, and sit by the window that faced the street. There, she watched the world carry on without her, a parade of strangers, in a city she no longer recognized. Later, she would tend to her garden, though it was mostly a patch of frozen dirt now, and feed the birds, her only regular visitors. Around 10 each morning, she'd walk the 5 blocks to the North Side bakery to buy a fresh roll of bread. She never needed more than one. It was the act that mattered. The smell of yeast, the warmth in her hands, the familiar hello from the girl at the counter. It was on one of those mornings, the kind where the air seemed brittle enough to shatter, that she noticed him. A tall, impossibly lean figure stood motionless near the bakery's entrance. He wasn't panhandling. He wasn't speaking. He was just there. His posture was alert, eyes fixed on the glass display inside as though trying to memorize every loaf and roll. He wore a threadbare jacket too small for his frame, and his hands were jammed deep into his pockets. There was something about him, not desperation exactly, but restraint, as if he were trying not to exist too loudly. Margaret didn't stop the first day. She noticed him and walked past. But that evening, as she sliced her bread and sipped her tea, she couldn't stop thinking about him. There had been hunger in his eyes, not just for food, but for shelter, for stillness, for a moment to breathe. The next morning she bought 2 rolls instead of 1. When she stepped out and saw him again, in almost the same spot, she didn't speak much, just extended her arm and offered the bag. He looked at her, startled, then at the roll. She expected him to hesitate, but instead he took it gently, like it was something sacred. "You look like you need it more than I do," she said softly. The young man nodded quickly, eyes darting away, unsure whether to thank her or disappear. His voice was low, rough around the edges. "Thank you," he managed, his accent thick, foreign. She didn't ask questions, didn't want to embarrass him. There was dignity in his silence, and she respected that. In the days that followed, it became something of an unspoken ritual. Some mornings, she would bring a small apple with the bread, once a thermos with a bit of soup. He never asked, he never lingered. He would take the offering with a nod, sometimes murmuring a thank you, always with eyes that didn't quite meet hers. He never told her his name. She didn't press. Names have weight, and perhaps he wasn't ready to carry it. What struck her most was how polite he was, always careful, always composed. He reminded her of one of her old students, the quiet ones who sat in the back, didn't make noise, but carried whole worlds inside them. Then one day he was gone. She waited the next day and the next. She still bought an extra roll, just in case, but the corner in front of the bakery remained empty. The boy, no, the young man, had vanished. As quietly as he had arrived, Margaret went on with her life. Her knees were starting to ache more. The mornings got colder. The street looked lonelier again. Weeks passed, then months. She stopped buying the second roll. It wasn't that she expected him to come back. She just missed the feeling of doing something that mattered, even if only for a stranger. She had no way of knowing who he was or where he had gone. All she had was a memory of thin shoulders, 2 long arms, and a pair of solemn eyes that had once looked at a piece of bread like it was salvation. For a long time she assumed that was the end of it. But life, as she would later discover, has a strange sense of balance. And sometimes the quietest gestures echo the loudest through time. Margaret had long stopped expecting surprises. Her world had become a collection of gentle repetitions, old books, lukewarm tea, classical music, playing softly from a second-hand radio. There was comfort in the known. Her eyes, weaker now, wandered slower across pages, and her memory, though mostly sharp, occasionally misplaced names or misplaced moments. But there was one face she never forgot. The tall boy by the bakery, hungry, quiet, respectful, had taken root somewhere deep in her recollection. He had no name, but his presence lingered like the shadow of a story left unfinished. One chilly afternoon, while waiting for her prescription at the neighborhood pharmacy, she picked up the local paper from the counter. She didn't care much for sports, but a bold headline caught her eye. Milwaukee Bucks draft unknown Greek teen. Below it, a photo. Not perfectly clear, but unmistakably him. That same angular face, now a little fuller, still carrying that cautious gravity in his eyes. His name sprawled across the caption in letters she couldn't quite pronounce. Giannis Antetokounmpo. She blinked at the paper, stunned by the improbable connection. It wasn't just resemblance, it was him. The boy who once took bread from her hands as if he wasn't sure he deserved it. The boy who said so little but conveyed everything in the way he held himself. He had a name now, and not just any name. One printed in bold across the city's newspapers. At first, Margaret wasn't quite sure what to make of it. It felt surreal, like recognizing a face from a dream only to realize it belonged to someone the world now watched. She clipped the article and pinned it to her refrigerator door with a faded flower magnet. Not because she expected anyone else to care, but because it felt important, like keeping a piece of a secret. Over the months, she started paying attention to the Bucks in a way she never had. She watched the games quietly from her recliner, squinting at the screen when Giannis was on the court. He didn't always play much at first. Commentators referred to him as raw, inexperienced, full of potential. Margaret didn't care for the analysis. What she saw was the same calm determination she remembered from the bakery stoop. Every time he ran the court, every time he defended with his long arms or hustled for a rebound, she saw echoes of that same dignity that made her hand him that first bag of bread. She never told anyone, not her few friends from the church circle, not the girl at the bakery who still recognized her after all these years. It wasn't that she wanted to keep it to herself, not exactly. It was more that she felt no claim over him. She hadn't changed his life. She hadn't given him anything lasting. She had simply been there in a moment when he needed something small. And maybe that had been enough. Years passed like turning pages in an old novel. Giannis began to grow into the role no one quite expected him to fill. He bulked up. He learned the language. He led. He became the kind of player people built franchises around. Margaret watched the narrative unfold. The Most Improved Player Award, the All-Star selections, the MVP chants. It all felt surreal, but also quietly satisfying. He had done it, on his own terms, in his own time. As Giannis ascended, Margaret's world began to shrink. The stairs in her house became more daunting. Her hands, once strong enough to grade essays and tend gardens, trembled a little more each week. Eventually, after a bad fall that fractured her hip, she was moved to a nursing facility on the west side of the city. It was small and clean, with well-meaning nurses and soft lighting in the halls. She didn't fight it. There was a kind of peace in surrendering to a slower life. In her new room, Margaret kept only a few personal items. A framed black and white photo of her husband, a well-worn collection of Emily Dickinson's poems, and the yellowed newspaper clipping, now folded and faded, showing a young Giannis on draft day, holding a jersey and smiling like he wasn't. Yet sure he belonged. She rarely had visitors. No children, no close family left. The staff liked her, called her Miss Maggs. She responded kindly, but rarely spoke more than she had to. Most days she sat by the window in her wheelchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes on the horizon. When the Bucks played, one of the nurses would sometimes wheel in a small TV, and Margaret would watch, never cheering, never reacting loudly, just nodding every time Giannis scored or made a pass that no one else could have seen coming. In one of his interviews, Giannis once mentioned being helped by strangers when he first arrived in the US. He said he remembered moments of kindness more than he remembered addresses or names. He didn't describe Margaret, not directly, but when he spoke about the lady who gave me bread when I had nothing, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't proof, not exactly, but it was enough. A kind of quiet confirmation that what she remembered, he remembered too, even if only as a feeling. But life was no fairy tale, and Margaret had long since accepted that some stories don't loop back around. She had no delusions about fate. People moved on. They became who they were meant to be. Her role had been a brief, silent one, and she was content with that. Still, there were nights when she allowed herself to wonder. Did he remember her face? Would he recognize her if they met again? Was she just one of many ghosts he carried from those early years? She never expected answers, never tried to reach out, but the newspaper clipping remained by her bedside, now creased and fragile like her own hands. Every time she looked at it, she smiled softly to herself, as if remembering a secret she hadn't told in years. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that somewhere in another part of the city, Giannis had begun to ask questions. It started simply, almost absently, during a conversation with his assistant. He mentioned the early days, the hunger, the struggle to find footing in a city that didn't yet feel like home. He spoke of the bakery, of the cold mornings, of the woman who gave him bread without asking his name. "I never got to thank her," he said, not expecting much of a response, but something about the way he said it stayed with his assistant. Quietly, respectfully, she began to ask around. A few older employees at the North Side bakery remembered an old woman who used to come every day. White hair, kind smile, bought just one roll most days, sometimes two. Giannis didn't build up hope. Milwaukee was a big city. People move, people pass. The past is slippery, but still, the thought wouldn't leave him alone. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her quiet routine. Mornings at the window, soup at noon, soft hymns from the hallway. The world beyond the nursing home felt distant, like a place she once visited and could no longer quite touch, until one afternoon a staff member approached her with a strange expression. "Miss Maggs, we have a visitor," she blinked. "A visitor?" The nurse only nodded, lips parted in something between awe and disbelief. Moments later, the door opened. A tall man stepped through, broad shoulders, kind eyes. She looked up, puzzled at first. His face was older now, more sculpted, but those eyes, those quiet, deep eyes, were exactly the same. He knelt in front of her, gently taking her hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice she hadn't heard in over a decade, he said softly, "You gave me bread when I had nothing. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask." Her mouth trembled, her eyes, long dulled by age, lit with sudden recognition. "You were the boy with the cold hands." He smiled. "I never forgot you." Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden, as she reached out and cupped his face with both hands, fragile and shaking. Neither did I. Days that followed that unexpected reunion passed in a kind of quiet reverence. The nurses at the care home moved more gently around Margaret, as if aware something sacred had occurred in room 214. Word had spread quickly, even if details were scarce. A few staff had taken discreet photos of Giannis Antetokounmpo walking down the hallway, pausing by the nurses' station to thank them for their work, shaking hands with the elderly man in the next room. But no one intruded on the moment that mattered, the one between him and Margaret. Giannis didn't arrive with cameras. There was no entourage, no press, no Instagram story, just him, in a plain jacket and jeans, showing up not as an NBA superstar, but as a young man who remembered. The moment he had stepped into that quiet room, seen the framed newspaper clipping, the old books, the blanket pulled tight over her knees, something inside him settled. It was as if a long unfinished sentence had finally found its period. He visited again the next day, and the day after that. At first, Margaret was too stunned to ask him anything. She watched him like he might disappear again, not because she doubted his sincerity, but because life had taught her that beautiful things were often fleeting. But he stayed. He pulled a chair beside her and listened to her stories, her soft, halting recollections of being a teacher, of walking through snow to buy bread, of once believing her small acts didn't matter. He told her about his mother, about his brothers, about sleeping on floors and sharing sneakers, and the endless miles they walked in Greece just to make it to practice. "I remember being so cold," he told her once, his voice low, "and not knowing if I'd eaten that day. Then you gave me bread and I felt seen. She nodded, eyes wet, fingers trembling as they closed around his. I didn't do much, she whispered. You did everything, he answered. Outside the care home, the world churned as usual. The Bucks pushed through the season. Cameras followed. Giannis's every dunk, every post-game quote, every laugh with teammates. He remained publicly the humble giant, intense on the court, generous off it. But privately, something had shifted. Those visits became more than just tributes to the past. They became a tether, a return to origin, a way to remain grounded. After nearly 2 weeks, he arrived one morning holding a worn notebook. He placed it in her lap. It's a plan, he said. Margaret blinked, adjusting her glasses. Her hands traced the cover. A plan. He nodded. Inside were pages of sketches, lists, names. It wasn't just a tribute. It was a mission. I've started a foundation, he said. In your name, the Holloway Fund. She looked up, confused. It'll provide meals. Warm meals delivered daily to elderly residents in Milwaukee who live alone. People like you. People who don't always ask for help but deserve dignity. Her lips parted, but no words came. It's already underway, he continued. I've talked to local businesses, donors. I'll fund the first 2 years myself. After that, we'll expand, not just food, but visits, companionship, medicine, drop-offs. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. You're naming it. After me? I'm naming it because of you, he said. There were moments in life that defied articulation, that stood outside the boundaries of language and left only silence to carry their weight. That moment was one of them. When the foundation was officially announced a few weeks later, Margaret's photo appeared beside Giannis's in newspapers across Wisconsin. A short statement quoted him. She gave me bread when she didn't know who I was. Now I give back in her name. Because kindness, the quiet kind, is what truly changes lives. The story exploded. Local news stations ran retrospectives. National media picked it up. Giannis honors elderly woman who fed him as teen. From bread to brotherhood, the quiet story behind the MVP. The simplicity of the gesture cut through the noise of the modern world. No brand attached, no product launch, just an honest attempt to repay a debt of heart. In the care home, Margaret watched it unfold on TV, stunned by the attention. Her name, her face, her ordinary kindness, suddenly on screens and in headlines. Reporters requested interviews. She declined most of them, preferring instead the quiet rhythm of her days and the now familiar visits from Giannis, who always knocked softly and never stayed too long. He brought her flowers, a small Bucks blanket, a necklace shaped like a tiny loaf of bread engraved with her initials on the back. You gave me hope, the note had said. She wore it every day. But time, as it always does, moved forward with relentless grace. One morning, Giannis arrived to find her asleep in her chair, a book resting on her chest. She woke slowly, smiled, but there was a new heaviness in her eyes. Later that day, a nurse pulled him aside gently. Her condition was worsening. Her heart was fragile. The visits comforted her, but her body was slipping toward the end. Giannis nodded quietly, absorbing the words like a veteran hears news from the front. That night he stayed longer than usual. He read to her, not a basketball biography or a press statement, but poetry from her own collection. She liked Dickinson, the nurse had told him. He read softly, slowly, stumbling through some of the older words, laughing at himself when he got them wrong. At one point, Margaret opened her eyes. You've become quite the reader, she said. I had a good teacher, he replied. She smiled, and that night, she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. 2 mornings later, she was gone. The nurses found her in her sleep, her hands folded over the book he had left her, the necklace still around her neck. The newspaper clipping was still pinned beside her bed. Her funeral was small, simple. A few staff from the home, 2 nieces from out of state, a pastor who had once been her student, and Giannis, tall, quiet, wearing a black suit and a single white flower pinned to his chest. He didn't speak at the podium. Instead, when the pastor asked if anyone wanted to say something, he stepped forward and read the same poem he had, read to her that last night. His voice cracked only once, and when he was finished, he placed the folded page inside her coffin next to the book. In the days that followed, the Holloway Fund received an outpouring of donations. Messages from elderly citizens poured in. Some were helped directly. Others were simply moved by the idea that someone, especially someone as famous as Giannis, had paused long enough to remember someone the world had forgotten. He continued the work, quietly, faithfully. Every year, on the anniversary of her passing, he visited the small bench placed near the Northside Bakery, now engraved with her name. He sat there with a bag of warm bread and waited, not for her, but for another hungry face, another silent plea in the cold, because once long ago someone had seen him, and now he would keep seeing others. Over time, the story faded from the headlines, but in Milwaukee, and in the hearts of those touched by it, the legacy lived on. Not just in meals delivered or names remembered, but in the belief that kindness, given freely and without expectation, can ripple through years and cities and souls, and sometimes a loaf of bread is enough to change the world.